Hi, and welcome to Exeter Terrestrials, a show where we will explore the varied facets of the unknown, from the paranormal to ufology to cryptozoology and more. I'm Valerie LaFaso. I'm one of your hosts, along with Mike Stevens and Andy Kitt. Today we have joining us Aleksandar Petakov, who is a documentary filmmaker and cryptozoology research. So I'd like to welcome Aleksandar.
Thank you guys for having me. Hope you're all guys doing well.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think I'd like to start us off. You do a lot of stuff. You're all over the place constantly, but you just had a really good weekend last weekend, correct?
Oh, yeah. We had a very interesting time. There's a kind of a case study we've sort of been doing with some colleagues of ours, Paul and Ben Eno, and some other folks, Shane Sirway, of this strange area in Pennsylvania where there seems to be a lot of anomalous activity. It's been nicknamed the Pennsylvania Triangle. And this was the second year I was involved in the case. Paul and Shane and some of the other guys have been going a little bit longer, I think 6 years now. Essentially, the property owners had found out about their research in other flap areas where there seems to be all this anomalous activity, and they reached out. And since then, we've kind of been adding team members and going down there and just spending the weekend and hosting town halls and talking to eyewitnesses. And it was very fascinating for me because that's where a lot of Bigfoot activity goes on. But they have all this other stuff, UFOs, strange lights, and these sorts of things. And we had some pretty interesting experiences down there. Basically, we saw, by definition, a UFO appear over the sky last technically Friday morning, right after midnight. We were all star watching. It was a beautiful, clear sky. It had rained earlier, and there was a lot of thunderstorms, but it cleared up. It was amazing. I was doing star photography, a little bit of astrophotography. And about 12:17 to 12:20, there was this object that appeared to look like a cloud that was illuminated. That was my first thought was it's just a cloud with the moon behind it or something. But there was not a single cloud in the sky, and this thing started moving in a very peculiar fashion, left to right, slowly moving along. And we started all looking at it, saying, "What is this? Somebody try and get a video of this." Paul had his night vision goggles that he had just gotten, so he wasn't too experienced with them, but he grabbed them and started filming, and we observed this thing for maybe 10 minutes or so as it moved through the sky in a very unusual fashion, and objects, at one point, a smaller, brighter object broke off of it and flew back into it. And then we watched this thing until it went over the tree line, and a few minutes later, we observed from right to left an object zip across the sky, a bright object, in a split second. So that was a very interesting experience.
And I believe we have the clip. If we can pull that up, maybe you can tell us what
absolutely.
we're looking at, or the still shot.
Yeah, so here's a little sample of the video. I mean, I think the video is in 3 minutes total that Paul managed to capture. You can see that smaller object actually move with it, and that, I believe, is the thing that we probably saw come off of it. Towards the end of the clip, unfortunately it's not on here, but in the full clip, the whole object changes shape. So it was very interesting to watch this, and the way it moved through the sky was very, very peculiar. And like I said, it was very strange. And it was truly UFO. I mean, we had that evening observed probably 40, 50 airplanes. There's a major kind of traffic pattern there from Pittsburgh and other areas of Pennsylvania, and people flying over that area. No plane exhibited the same properties. There was no haze or cloud appearance around it. I saw at least 6 shooting stars that night. We saw lightning bugs. There were lightning storms earlier in the evening going on way in the distance. So this thing didn't appear like any of the other explainable objects in the sky that we had seen. So it was intriguing.
It's got like this weird toroidal shape that, that's something you see in nature very often.
No, we were trying to figure out if it was like donut shaped or what, but it to the eye, it really appeared like a sort of illuminated cloud, and that had something that came off of it at one point and go back to it. And playing back the audio just a few days ago, I think Shane or somebody was trying to film while we were doing this with their phone, and of course you can't see anything, but you can hear our reactions, which I think is really good because it kind of helps contain the record of what was going on.
Right.
And you hear us all screaming, "Oh my God, there's another thing coming off of it!" And everyone is kind of going crazy about it. But unfortunately, the only good video we really got was from the night vision goggles, and thank God that Paul had pulled those out and quickly just looked at it, and we're hoping to have that video kind of analyzed. And the clip that I showed was in the negative, so it appeared, I just put in the negative to kind of enhance it a little bit, and you can clearly see that object, which looks like a star but moves completely with it, because there are stars in the video as well, but they stay stationary, and this thing glides with this larger object that is kind of with a haze around it.
One thing that, well, it's kind of late now, but if it could have had more background, I mean, there's a little bit of the tree there, but it's really hard to estimate, what angle it is off the horizon and stuff like that. But that was very, very, very cool. Whereabouts in Pennsylvania?
So it's western central Pennsylvania. It's an area called Du Bois.
Okay.
And there's much of Pennsylvania has a lot of these kind of anomalous areas, the Chestnut Ridge area south of Pittsburgh. Pennsylvania is now apparently the third best state to see Bigfoot, according to some new data. And we did a little presentation at a kind of a town hall about that, and we all talked about our experiences in the area, and then I talked about why I think Pennsylvania has a lot of these Bigfoot sightings. And it's really interesting for us as researchers because we had people coming from different perspectives. I was coming more from the cryptozoology side. I'm trying to figure out why all these Bigfoot sightings are occurring in these areas where you have red orbs and glowing things and UFOs, and a lot of people see black helicopters. We talked to a young kid who had seen a black helicopter just the week before we were there. As we know, that's illegal to have a black helicopter, but in a lot of these areas across the country, you have people reporting black helicopters, and we know there's really only one group that can get away with that sort of thing, and they're the ones that write the laws. So,
right.
So it's interesting. It was very intriguing just kind of talking to people about the different types of phenomena, because there's really something for everybody, whichever angle you're into. The paranormal, practically, it's in these sorts of spots. And, there's areas like the Bridgewater Triangle. Everyone's heard of that.
Right.
Bermuda Triangle. Other areas, it isn't really a defined triangle. It's just that's the easiest way, I guess, in our minds to rationalize it. And
Right.
that's kind of catchy. Like you just say triangle and you imagine it. But as we know, some phenomena will happen in maybe 20 miles from the area, but are kind of still attributed to it.
Right. Well, the orb thing, I mean, that's actually, there's other areas of the Appalachians that do, Brown Mountains is part of the Appalachians, also has similar light phenomenon. But the Bigfoot thing, can you clarify that? I mean, why would Bigfoot be showing up there as opposed to, I don't know, northern Maine or...
Oh, well, he shows up in northern Maine too. But, population-wise, northern Maine doesn't have a lot of people. You need a lot of people. I mean, you need people to have sightings, basically. Traditionally, the idea was that the states out west, like Washington, California, and Oregon, were the top states to see Bigfoot in. And, I kind of talked about that in my presentation there, where I said, why did Pennsylvania suddenly beat Oregon? In terms of suitable habitat, there's very interesting, if you look at average rainfall precipitation across the country, from the eastern seaboard and then out west, you'll see a drop-off right around the Midwest. That's where the deciduous forests stop, and that's where the plains begin, the corn country, all that sort of stuff, the flyover states, whatever you want to call it. But then you go out west, you have the temperate rainforests and the mountains and the Cascades and all up into British Columbia and into Alaska. And that's where there seems to be a big concentration of Bigfoot sightings. Well, great apes need a certain amount of precipitation to live.
Right.
And a lot of people have theorized that if Bigfoot is a sort of ape or whatever kind of creature it is, it lives in areas that are forested that would be rich in nutrients and other sorts of things, and their habitat overlaps a lot with things like black bears. So you'll see, if you look at a map, put side by side the precipitation map with a map of Bigfoot sightings over the past 50 years across the country, you'll see they almost perfectly mirror the rainfall. You'll see, in the desert states out in the Southwest, there aren't that many sightings other than in the mountains where they get a lot of snow and rain.
Right.
And like the Rockies in Colorado, you've got part of the state is desert, part is rich forest that hosts other sorts of wildlife. So you can directly correlate those two, which I think is pretty interesting. But a state like Pennsylvania has a population, I believe, of 12 or 14 million, whereas Oregon has 4 million, and they're all concentrated essentially in the Portland area,
Right.
and in a couple other places, Eugene, some other cities. And there's a lot more treacherous terrain, mountains that people don't inhabit in Oregon, so there just aren't enough people to have sightings as opposed to Pennsylvania, where you have millions of acres of forests, but you have a lot more agriculture, the terrain is easier, they're much more rolling sort of mountains. And throughout Appalachia, you have the mountains that are going through there in that cultural region. There's a lot of sightings of Bigfoot, and this is kind of habitat you'd expect for any sort of creature to live. Bears and deer and other animal inhabit these areas. So I think there's a lot of factors to it, but primarily I'd say population plays a role in some of these states that have a higher population.
Now, is the population of Pennsylvania tending to move de-urbanize, or is there a lot of encroachment going on that you think is exacerbating the situation, or is it just it is what it is?
Yeah, partially. It's if you look at the density, obviously places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh tend to have the most people, maybe Scranton, that sort of area. And you can look at these maps right on Wikipedia. Any source online will show you. But there are a lot, like I said, smaller towns throughout Pennsylvania and a lot of agriculture still. And there's a lot of people in the woods because a lot of hunters, most of it's a rural state. So there's a lot of that culture. Sure, I think the overall trend across the country is probably people are urbanizing more. A lot of these towns, especially in places like the Midwest, are kind of dying off. The young people are moving out. They're going more to urban areas, but there's still a lot of people who live in these kind of old ways, the mountain ways. So those are the kind of people that are out there. They're the ones that would have an experience. And just like in New England too, we know the northern parts of the New England, there's not as many people as there would be in the southern parts. So while there are sightings in northern New England, northern Maine, northern New Hampshire, they're not as many as you'd expect. But when there's a population center like Berlin, New Hampshire, there tends to be sightings right on the outskirts of town, because you step outside of town and it's millions of acres of protected forest land.
Right.
All right, so to switch gears just a little bit, my question for you is, which came first, filmmaking or cryptozoology studying?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know. I was always into documentaries and films as a kid. And I was, my father told me the story of the Yeti, and that's kind of what got me interested in the whole subject. And I think they just kind of grew together, because as a kid, I would just watch any documentary I could about Bigfoot or cryptozoology or kind of unknown. I was obsessed with the History Channel and these sorts of programs. And as I got older, I guess I was more of an armchair researcher, and I would do my own amateur sort of filmmaking stuff, but it wasn't really about cryptozoology. That wasn't until I decided to start making my own documentaries, and I figured that was kind of a way to research the phenomena, because I don't really consider myself one of these people that go out there squatching all the time and within the camo and kind of knocking on trees. It's fun going out and doing that every once in a while, but when you're doing a project like a documentary, you have to learn a lot about the subject matter, not only particular creature or mystery area or whatever you may be looking at, but the regional history, characteristics, the terrain, all this sort of stuff. You get to do boots on the ground. You talk to the witnesses. You talk to people who are experts or people who study the phenomena. You also talk to skeptics and people who will perhaps give you a contrary position. And with all that, I try and kind of put that together and put it into a project and say, hey, this is what I kind of observed. I don't put too much of my own personal opinion in it. This is just what I came across through my research. And like I said, I think it's a good way to research subjects, because you get a holistic sort of picture of a certain topic.
It just seems to me that, especially with Bigfoot, that the majority of the encounters, it's not even like the majority, it's like the overwhelming majority of the encounters are locals, and locals generally have information about cryptids anyhow. One of the things that stands out in my mind is that there was a type of deer discovered in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The residents they always knew it was there, and they talked about it. It took a soldier who actually had a degree in it to say, look, this is something new, but they always knew. And I always wondered on the people who go Sasquatch hunting, what their success rate is, because it seems that chance encounters are rare to begin with, and it's just a matter of being in the right place at the right time. Is there a substantial difference in the number of sightings by people deliberately looking for it compared to like general population or locals that you're aware of?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it really depends on person to person in terms of the researchers. You have people who have all kinds of theories about what is going on, and I think the problem is when people get so involved that maybe they have a Bigfoot on the brain, or like they want so hard to believe that something is attributed to this that they will, not to say fabricate, but maybe their mind will make it work that this is obviously, this tree that was bent over was done by Bigfoot. So I think there's a little bit of that kind of confirmation bias that comes with it. What for me is the most interesting are the stories by the locals, and even further back before we had Bigfoot as kind of a cultural figure, which since the 1950s has kind of been the term Bigfoot, and before that you had a little bit of the abominable snowman in popular culture. But I really like the older stories that go back into regional areas. So like in New Hampshire, the wood devil stories from up north, the Pamula in Maine. You had other stories, all these newspaper clippings from the 1800s describing wild men. When they learned about the gorilla that was discovered in Africa, then they would say, there was a gorilla that attacked a Gettysburg resident in 1924, for example. It was a recent clipping I talked about in Pennsylvania. So there's all these kind of older stories out west, especially, stories of hairy giants that lived in the mountains and these sorts of things. And for me, it's interesting, too, with the Native American culture and the various cultures that existed. They weren't obviously a unified culture, and they all had their own different traditions, many of them oral, and many of them had stories of strange, giant, man-like creatures in the woods, and some were very aggressive. Some would kidnap their women and children. Some were considered cannibals. Others were considered to be benevolent forest giants, protectors of the forest. And recently I listened to a lecture by Anna Nakaris, who's a kind of a primatologist for Oxford University, and she talked about doing research on these little primates called slow lorises. They're these small little nocturnal animals in Indonesia. And somebody had posed the question about, what do the local tribes talk about these things? Pre kind of Western science, what were people using to describe these things? And they said, well, it was interesting. You could go to 4 different tribes in the area. One tribe will say, oh, when we see one of these things in the woods, it's a demon. You have to kill it right away. The next tribe over, maybe 10 miles, will say, oh, it's a protector of the forest. We honor them. Another tribe will say, if you see one, you'll be cursed. But they're all describing the same thing. They're just having different qualities attributed to. So you see in upstate New York, the Iroquois had the tales of the stone giants, described as they would chase people down. I've talked to people out in California. They say the Yurok tribe in Northern California, for example, near where the Patterson-Gimlin film was taken, and the actual Bigfoot term originated, they would say, oh, it's kind of like a big brother type figure. So, they could all be describing the same thing, but just attributing different characteristics to it, which I think is pretty fascinating. And then you get on to, when Europeans moved to the New World and the kind of culture that came with that, and stories like the Ohio grassman or the skunk ape in the South, and the Honey Island swamp monster, the Fouke monster, various stories that kind of came about before people even knew the term Bigfoot.
Right. Because I am aware of at least some folklore stories as people went into New Hampshire and began deforesting. They completely stripped New Hampshire of lumber at one point. But as they kept going deeper and deeper into the thing, there were reports. Monadnock had reports. There's lots of them. Do you collect that kind of literature, or?
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in it. Whenever I come across a story, especially from the local areas, because I think, especially with a subject like Bigfoot, people typically think of it as being just in the Northwest or in other parts of the country. But we have a lot of reports throughout New England, and because people have been living in this area for so long, and a lot of it was clear cut, and now the forests have come back. Maine is one of the most forested states in the country, as is New Hampshire, and Vermont is trailing closely behind it. So you have millions and millions of acres, and there's a lot less people living on farms now. Like we said, everyone's kind of going to urban areas. So maybe if, like other creatures that perhaps have returned, like mountain lions, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
There aren't any mountain lions in New Hampshire.
No,
the Forest Service says there aren't any.
Definitely not. No, we'll get into that in a little bit, because that has been very interesting.
Speaking about Bigfoot in New Hampshire, you've done an interview where they don't consider him Bigfoot; they call him the Shy Man.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that in a second. But you've also co-created or given the information for a comic book with our friends Michael and Michelle Mitchell.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I've always been interested in the local stories. So I'd done a documentary a couple years ago about a friend of mine who's actually involved in the Abenaki community in New Hampshire, which is not a recognized tribe by the state of New Hampshire, unlike Vermont and Maine. In the area where he lives in Berlin, that surrounding area, Coos County, has a lot of stories of the wood devils, which are these old logging stories that would be described. And I recently found out, too, that there are stories that were told to people as far back as the 70s, just keep your kids out of the woods, the wood devils will come get you. So a lot of these stories we kind of compiled and put them into a comic book. I think Michael had messaged me last summer and just said, are there any Bigfoot reports in New Hampshire? I'm like, oh boy. I just started sending him stuff, and they put in all the hard work, but I let them. I wrote up all this kind of stories and told them which would be the best stories, and they wanted to do the 1970s, and there were some particularly fascinating encounters, some of my personal favorites that had happened during that time period.
So let's watch the Shy Man clip. And
Sure.
Mike is the shy man.
Apparently.
Area several years ago. I wound up calling it Woladoc so that I would not give away the location in discussing it with anyone. And I went in and spent the next 9 months going in roughly almost every day to observe and research and collect as much information as I possibly could.
Yeah, so I mean that a little bit more about that documentary specifically. That was, like I said, about this particular area and this researcher and sort of his interpretation. And according to him, shy man is what the Abenaki would call it, and the term was tsatsiboba, and it kind of translates to shy man. And I think it fits pretty well with the sort of general Bigfoot description. Overwhelming majority of sightings that have taken place throughout North America describe it as leaving the scene or fleeing. People are getting fleeting glimpses of it. It's not something that's really sticking around that long. Sure, there are those types of encounters, but elusive and shy would definitely be a good way to describe this creature.
Have you had any personal experiences with Bigfoot sightings of your own?
So no, I've never had a sighting of my own. I still try and ride a little bit on the skeptical side, say, maybe it's all a figment of our collective imagination, a kind of projection of a beastly sort of nature that we've inherited throughout the centuries, our need for mystery and monsters. But, I lean a little bit more on the side that there probably is something that exists, because the amount of eyewitnesses that are out there and some of the stories I've heard, people I've talked to that have, they're not on TV, they're not going on podcasts, they're people that are just like, I'm glad somebody else has had these experiences, and they'll come out and they'll talk about it, and they don't really want to be publicized or anything. It's like, what do they have to gain by telling some of these stories? There's something going on. I really do believe that, and will it ever be proven? I don't know, but it's very fascinating, kind of on the search for it. So I've not had my own experiences. I've had, I've heard noises and kind of smells out in the woods, but nothing I can definitively say was what a Bigfoot is purported to be.
So what kind of evidence would you say would be definitive for you personally?
I think for me, I suppose it would be having a visual. I mean, I'm not really trying to convince anybody that these things exist. I have plenty of friends and colleagues that's kind of their life's goal. Maybe a lot of them have had their own experiences, and it drove them to a point where they essentially said, I want to prove to the world what this is, so people can stop calling me crazy or these sorts of things. You have an experience like this is something that's not supposed to exist. A lot of times that can be a good motivator to try and prove it. So a lot of people research based on that, others based on interest. But for me, I guess it would be having a visual. The UFO I saw, for example, last weekend in Pennsylvania, that was the strangest thing I've ever seen. And nobody can really take that experience away from me. And the fact that it was documented with video and audio, for me is, that's definitive proof that there are things that we just don't know about and we cannot conventionally explain. I mean, maybe that craft could have been secret military tech, but that's, like I said, it's truly a UFO by the definition of unidentified flying object. But yeah, so I would say for Bigfoot, it would probably be having a visual sighting. Science says they're going to need a body. They're going to need a body or DNA evidence, body part, or something that's able to be repeatable and demonstratable that it's a living being, or scientific proof that this thing is actually out there and cataloged, and that's the way they kind of look at it. The footprints and the videos and even hair samples just won't be enough, and that's 40, 50 years people have been trying to collect that, and it hasn't proven really anything, unfortunately.
So you don't spend your time just tracking down strange creatures in the woods, too. You've also spent some time on the water.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You did a great mini-series on Champy out of Lake Champlain. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've always been fascinated by lake monsters. Loch Ness, of course, everyone has heard about that. I mean, Bigfoot and Loch Ness are probably the two most famous monsters in the world that everyone knows about. Everyone hears about Loch Ness, and it's funny that I had always been more interested in Loch Ness than I had in Lake Champlain. Growing up in New England, it's 3 hours away from Lake Champlain, yet half the ocean, across from from Loch Ness. So I never really put much thought into Lake Champlain until I did a mini series on it in 2017, 2018 for a really awesome production company called Small Town Monsters that does a lot of documentaries about these tales throughout rural America of these really small town monsters and these stories and these creatures like Bigfoot and Mothman. And Champ was probably the most interesting project I've done, and I'm still kind of hopelessly obsessed with that mystery. Because once you go down the rabbit hole, as you know, it's just you kind of keep going, and you get into this place where you're just constantly learning about new encounters and things that have happened in the history. So it was a 6-part or a 5-part miniseries where I basically 20 minutes a piece, and I would dedicate each episode to a different facet of the mystery. So one episode would be more about the history of the lake. It was very fascinating history, how it used to be part of the ocean, and a lot of the species that are in the lake today are actually directly adapted from salt water at one point, 10,000 years ago, very recent history. Another episode will be more about eyewitnesses and the evidence, so the pictures, the famous Sandra Mancy photo, some of the video clips, and then the individual research teams. And I focused on 2 groups of kind of researchers, Champ Search, and then another group, Martis Dranginis research crew, and then kind of tying it in episode 5 with Small Towns, Big Monster, kind of about the local cultural impact. Because as you know, Vermont has a team called the Lake Monsters. That's their minor league baseball team based off of Champ. Champ's their mascot. There's little Champ car washes, and there's a lot of local stuff where you can go, Champ mini golf, that sort of thing. But it's more locally known. It's not as well known as something like Loch Ness. So I've always found that interesting. But yeah, I mean, I don't think it'll be the last time I focus on that particular subject. It's just whenever I go up there, I'm always looking out for the water. It's a beautiful and fascinating place.
If your interest was drawn to Loch Ness, have you been there?
Yeah, so I was in Loch Ness in 2014. That was kind of my first sort of documentary about this subject because we traveled through Loch Ness, and I just kind of had my camera and just filmed around and interviewed some folks and put a little thing together. And I came out of Loch Ness, unfortunately, a little bit more skeptical perhaps than I was before. I think there's just been a lot of issues with the Loch Ness story, and I'm a little bit more skeptical about it being some sort of ancient creature or something along those lines as I am perhaps Lake Champlain. But it's a fascinating place too. It's one of these places that you grow up seeing on TV and you finally go there and experience it. It's a very special kind of thing to go to a place like Loch Ness or some of the other spots across the world that are cryptozoology or paranormal sort of notable spots, yeah.
And I think we do have a clip or a trailer from the Champ series that we can watch, but everybody who's watching this, what's your website and your company for your filmmaking? So if they want to go see these on their own and get the whole documentaries.
Sure, yeah. Petakov Media, that's my site. That's just PETAKOV media.com. There's links to everything on there. The Champ series is on Amazon. You can buy the DVD directly off my website, or really any of the other documentaries. I got links to all the stuff, and a lot of the Bigfoot stuff that I've done is on YouTube. That's free, but you can also get the DVD with some like bonus features on it, and that's just the best place to kind of follow my work. Yeah.
And if we can play the Champ footage now.
Had a long neck, smaller head, but the body was huge. You couldn't miss it.
A big head's coming out of the water, about 2 feet or whatever out of water, swimming by him and awake in back of him. And they didn't want nobody to know what they saw.
It's not too far-fetched to say that there's a population of unknown animals in this lake.
I base a lot of my research and methodology on those eyewitness sightings. Those people have seen something different. They're very adamant about what they've seen. They're very direct in the colors, the shape, the head size, all that.
The only thing that's ever gonna make a difference with mainstream science and put this animal in the zoology books, if it exists, is a biological specimen. And I say this having seen something that I believe is one of these animals.
very well done series, and I like how you don't try to push people into this is why you should believe, this is why you shouldn't believe. You cover a lot of stuff, not just the monster, but the history, the agriculture, or not agriculture, but ecosystem of the lake itself. It's really a great series.
Thank you. Yeah, I just tried to focus on those aspects, and I thought this overall story of Lake Champlain was just so fascinating too, that was definitely a part of why this mystery is kind of endearing. And whether or not this thing exists, the mystery I think will always be there, because it's a really weird body of water. You know, it's this thing that's sandwiched in between the Adirondacks and the Green Mountains, and beautiful summer day can turn into a dangerous storm where you have to head back on your boat instantly. And there's a lot of mystery and intrigue. And just having explored that area now after the series and spending time with locals and researchers, you kind of get a feeling and appreciation for it. You know, there's areas that you never would have known existed. You know, these massive cliffs in some parts, swamps that look like they're parts of the South, where you can just picture something lurking around in there, and you can't really get in there as a person. I mean, even with a boat, you'd have a hard time. Perhaps a drone is the best way to get into a spot like this. And believe me, I did fly my drone in a lot of these spots. But I thought the overall story and the history of people inhabiting the lake, and the fact that this monster was famous before anyone even knew about Loch Ness. I mean, in the 1870s, you had a big kind of amount of sightings in the southern part of the lake, where P.T. Barnum even put up a huge bounty at the time on Champ's head, dead or alive, and all other times in the 1800s there were bounties put on this creature, and then it kind of faded into obscurity. In the 1930s, Loch Ness became popular, and then Champ sort of had another comeback in the 70s and 80s, especially with things like the Mansi photo, this kind of endearing photo of this creature or something sticking its head out of the water that was never proven to be fake. It was proven that whatever was in the photo was actually there, that the photo was not tampered with. So in today's terms, somebody could easily Photoshop something like that in there. But this object was truly on the water, and that was determined by video or photo experts. So whether or not it was a hoax or not, that's where the question comes down. But having spoken to Sandra Mansi before she passed away, for the interview for the documentary, she seemed very sincere in the way she presented her story, and I don't believe that her or her family are the ones that perpetuated this. If it was a hoax, they truly just saw something, and I think the chances of it being a hoax are unlikely. There's something else that could perhaps explain or account for it.
Is there a proliferation of, with digital, it is easy to fake, but you would think that if they're fake, there would be a lot more videos, photographs, yada, yada, now than there were 20 years ago. Is that the case?
Not really. I mean, it seems like with the Champ, there's certain photos and videos and other pieces of evidence. Some people think bioacoustics with some of these kind of echolocations or supposed echolocations that have been taken in the lake might be related. But it seems like every decade or so, there's a piece of footage or a photo that comes out that convinces people, maybe there is something. And I think one of the more interesting ones to me is it's something called the Olsen video, which I think came out in 2008. Where this strange creature is seen in the morning just swimming through the water, and it almost kind of changes shapes, and very, very odd. And wildlife biologists were consulted about it, and they said, it wasn't a moose or a deer swimming, because you can imagine some sightings will be explained by something as mundane as a deer swimming early in the morning. You see like a head sticking out and bobbing. Somebody says that's a monster, it's Champ. That some part of sightings will be explained by that, but this footage, it shows this thing it changes, the neck gets longer, then it gets shorter, very, very weird. There's other pieces of footage, and some people have suggested kind of my personal favorite hypothesis, just because I think it's cool, is that perhaps it's some sort of a giant turtle that has a very long neck, and that's why it's able to kind of change the shape of it. And I think that's very interesting, because most people think that it would be something like a plesiosaur or some sort of prehistoric marine reptile, and the closest living relatives we have to anything of that nature today are sea turtles. And a lot of turtles, they're directly related to sort of the marine aquatic reptiles, which were different from dinosaurs a little bit, just because of their morphology and everything. So the giant turtle theory, that's kind of my favorite one. But I don't know. It's just there's the amount of sightings, and some of the people I talk to, the same thing with Bigfoot. It's people that are like, I had this experience, and I know what I saw. I've lived on this lake my whole life. I've fished this whole area. I know what's in the water. I've seen 10-foot sturgeon come out of the water. This thing was none of those things. Or land sightings. People seeing something run across the road from the bay into the creek. These sorts of things that really make you wonder. I mean, one of my favorite eyewitness sightings from the 1950s, a guy I interviewed for the series, and they had seen this kind of dinosaur-like head come out of the water as they were fishing. And there were 6 of them. They said, what are we going to tell people? He said, don't tell anybody anything. They're going to think we're crazy. They didn't start talking about this until the 1970s, when champ became kind of, again, a cultural phenomena where news, the local news was doing pieces on it, and people started selling champ T-shirts, and it became a thing. A lot of people were just scared to talk about these sightings, and yeah.
If I remember correctly from years ago watching like Unsolved Mysteries and shows like that, there's a lake in Canada that also has sightings. Is that someplace you've been to or plan to go to?
I think you're probably talking about Lake Okanagan in British Columbia, which has Ogopogo, as the name is called, and it's a similar kind of monster. I've not been there. I'd love to. I think British Columbia is really cool because it has these temperate rainforests, and that's actually where the word Sasquatch comes from. That's where I believe a missionary in the area learned about these stories that local tribes had in the coastal regions about this hairy creature, and they called it something like Sasquatch, and he kind of anglicized it a little bit, and that's where Sasquatch comes from. So they have a lot of sightings in British Columbia of both that. They have a sea monster on the coast called Cadborosaurus, which supposedly had a carcass that was discovered, I think, in the 1920s or 30s that vanished, disappeared. And then they have this lake, Okanagan, which has a long history of sightings as well. I'd love to check out all those. And some people have even speculated that Okanagan was connected to the ocean at one point, and that perhaps whatever this Cadborosaurus thing is, that it's somewhat connected because the descriptions tend to be similar. But with a lot of lake monster sightings, the general reports are, people seeing humps in the water, multiple humps, and those ones are a little bit more ambiguous in my opinion because they could be anything. I mean, there have been 14-foot sturgeon, found in Lake Champlain, and if you were to see that come up by the side of your boat, that would by definition be a monster, truly a wonder of nature. But the sightings that interest me more are the ones where people see a head and a neck come out of the water, or they see it come out on land, or doing something else that you just can't explain away with it was a big fish. Because, like I said, deer and other things can explain one portion of sightings, as can perhaps seeing a big fish in the wrong lighting or the right timing. It just looks a lot bigger than it is. But these other sightings can't really be explained as easily.
So cryptozoology isn't just about monsters and creatures that we don't know if they exist or not. Some of the other parts are creatures we thought were supposed to be extinct and we find out they aren't, or animals or creatures that we know exist but are in a weird place, like a kangaroo in Ohio. Do we have anything like that going on here in New Hampshire?
Yeah, we do. And just to reiterate a little bit, cryptozoology is the study of hidden or unknown animals. So, hidden, that could be anything. Some people even consider things like the alligators in the sewer story to technically be cryptozoology. And you've got out-of-place animals. And one of the interesting aspects as well is it's not just these kind of creatures that some people say, oh, there's no way that thing could exist. Or Mothman, that's more extraterrestrial than it is a creature of the earth. And then you have things like the thylacine in Australia, which is the Tasmanian tiger, this creature that supposedly went extinct that people still see sightings of. And in New England, we have this big thing with mountain lions, and that's kind of where my latest project has been, dealing with the sightings and the decades of sightings. Mountain lions are supposed to have been extinct in New England essentially since the late 1800s, when the last of them were killed off by people kind of settling these mountainous areas. And then when the logging began, a lot of the habitat was destroyed. That pushed out a lot of other animals, moose, bear. We've seen some of those animals make comebacks in the northern parts of New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont, certainly in the last century, since, as I said, the forestation has come back. A lot of the wildlife has. And some people claim mountain lions have come back. Others say they never left. So it's been a very interesting kind of project, just talking about the different facets and what seems to be almost like a conspiracy by some agencies, and not to fan the flames, but just kind of what I've experienced with people, their stories that they've told me. There's a big distrust between fish and game wardens and wildlife departments throughout New England and people who claim to have sightings or credible kind of evidence that they have of mountain lions.
I heard a story that there was a new species of wolf discovered in New Hampshire in like the 40s, and the Fish and Game's response was, okay, catch a few to verify that it exists, then they immediately exterminated them all.
Maybe the coy wolf is probably what you're talking about. I'm not entirely sure about that, but there's a lot of stories like that. Some people say, oh, wolves were brought into certain areas to control deer population, or I've even heard stories of people saying things like mountain lions were brought into the states to control deer population by the government. I mean, there's always this sort of, it's easy to say the government, is this
Right.
kind of thing that's always doing something nefarious. There's certain elements, but I'm not too familiar with that story. But just like I said, with the mountain lions, that's really where there seems to be sort of a disconnect, because we have so much territory, and there have been credible instances of mountain lions in New England recently. I mean, one of the only ones really that's confirmed officially on the books was in 2011 in Connecticut, where in Greenwich, which is one of the richest towns in Connecticut, not that far from New York City, a mountain lion was struck crossing a road, and confirmed, and its genetic makeup was found to be from the Black Hills of South Dakota. So it apparently traveled that whole distance. Wow. So then, a lot of the people said, okay, well, mountain lions may be in New England, but all we have going on here is males from the western populations that are moving eastward, trying to establish families, trying to find partners, not finding any females, and just kind of wandering around. There's ample resources. I mean, they would be on the top of the food chain. We have so many deer and so many other examples of wildlife that they would just be able to do whatever they want and stay hidden. Cats are very elusive, so people may see them here and there, but it's easier to just say that we don't have any resident populations. And some of the researchers I've interviewed and talked to say, no, that's not the case. They believe there are long-term populations that have been living in certain areas, and that's been very interesting to kind of dig through the past couple months.
Well, and a lot of the sightings are not just solely up north or in the wooded areas of the state. They seem to be in the southern part and the very populated areas of the state as well.
Yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised. Like I kind of said with the Bigfoot stuff, you'd think more sightings would be in the more of these wilderness areas, but they're only around the towns because you don't have people living in the middle of the White Mountain National Forest in certain parts of land. So a lot of most of the mountain lion sightings are taking place in New Hampshire, specifically in the Seacoast area, southern New Hampshire, and mostly I found in the western part along the Connecticut River sort of area, because that I think is the most rural part of New Hampshire that's the most populated, because you still have a lot of towns and a lot of farms and rural sort of areas. Same thing on the Vermont side, a lot of sightings in that area, which makes sense because, like I said, you need people to have sightings of these things. And then you look at like the White Mountain National Forest, and there aren't that many sightings. Now, I've talked to people who have said they saw mountain lion cross the trail in front of them hiking, Mount Adams or some of the other big peaks up there. So that's very interesting, but you don't have that long-term presence. So there have been a lot of sightings in the southern regions of the state, and it's been very fascinating to kind of find out more about those. And I talked to Fish and Game too, and their response is sort of, hey, we get these reports all the time. Some of them turn out to be fake. Some of them turn out to be somebody saw a bobcat in the weird angle, and other ones are, we just can't confirm it or corroborate it, and they're kind of stuck because it's tough to establish the fact that there is a population. Everyone's tight on funding and budgeting, so it's hard to say, well, we're going to allocate this amount of resources to study if there are mountain lions in whatever part of New Hampshire. It's very tough to kind of to sell that. So I'll give them credit there, just saying, it's a bit difficult to deal with that, and then it just it creates distrust with the public, though. As I said, people just say, oh, the government is just covering it up right away.
So, as you know, because I mentioned this to you, I had my own sighting
Yep.
of a dead mountain lion. It was 1995, I think, and it was on the highway, I-93, going north, getting off at exit 4 to go into Londonderry, very populated area. At the time, I knew what it was. It was huge, and I recognized it by the tail. The tail is very identifiable, and it was blowing in the wind of the cars going by, which is why I saw it so clearly. And I remember being surprised, not because it was a mountain lion, but because of where it was. At that time, I was in college. I didn't grow up in a hunting family. We weren't out in the woods a lot. I didn't know there weren't supposed to be mountain lions in New Hampshire. That wasn't something I knew at the time. So I found that interesting. But do you think part of the reason why the officials try to deny that these are here is fear? Because if people think these are in their backyards in Londonderry, New Hampshire, they might freak out.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely an element of hysteria. And I've heard stories similar to yours where people have said, we saw a dead mountain lion, and it just kind of it never made the news, never was mentioned anywhere. And maybe somebody just came with a pickup and just threw it in the back, and that was the last of it. I think with the Connecticut case where it was killed, people were taking pictures of it, and it was on the side of the road. cell phones, as opposed to perhaps when you had this experience, there weren't cell phones as readily available, iPhones able to take photos, so you couldn't really deny it. I mean, so I think there's an element of fear that people don't want to admit that something like this dangerous could be right in their backyard. And as I said, cats are very elusive. This one was in Greenwich, which isn't a super forested area, and it was just moving through little tracts of land, little pieces at night and kind of stalking around. So in an area like New Hampshire where there's a lot more woods, yeah, you do have a lot of sightings. To this day in areas like Derry, Londonderry, Merrimack, Nashua, that whole area, there have been sightings kind of around the peripheries of town, and even in some areas that are a little bit more residential. These animals, like many other species, when you encroach on their territory, they kind of adapt in a lot of ways. That's why we have bears in a lot of places in New Hampshire that will dig through the trash and these sorts of things that become a nuisance. So I think the fear is on the part of the officials a lot is that if these creatures get too comfortable near human civilization, that they might want to attack people, and then they wouldn't want hysteria, everyone grabbing their guns and running in the woods and shooting at everything that moves. So that I would imagine that's definitely something you'd want to avoid, and creating any sort of hysteria around an issue like that. So it's a very, very tricky kind of thing to maneuver. There is an official statute in the state of New Hampshire, which I've tracked down, which says that you're not allowed to kill a mountain lion in the state unless your immediate person or property, including livestock, is in direct threat or danger. So you cannot technically kill them because if the eastern mountain lion has been officially declared as extinct, even though that's just sort of a subgroup of Puma concolorus, which is mountain lions, as we have in Florida, a population, Florida panthers. They're just a regional adaptation of the larger species, so they're not like a different species. So a couple of years ago, they declared the eastern Puma, eastern mountain lion, totally extinct, even though a lot of people would disagree. And I think a lot of the ways of explaining, well, it's just western cats moving eastward. We definitely have a little bit of that. Maybe we have a mixture. I don't know. I'm not here to, kind of give my opinion. I'm more talking about what other researchers out there who spend a lot more time analyzing the sightings, and you have sightings going back to the 1930s. I mean, does that mean that these things were as far back as then moving this way? I don't know. But it's interesting you mentioned the tail. The tail is very important in that aspect because you could see a bobcat, maybe in the right sort of strange lighting, you would say, oh, that was a mountain lion. But when you hear somebody mentions the tail, that's when there's only one thing in North America that has that sort of tail, that size, and that would be the mountain lion.
Yeah.
So we have the trailer for that, so I think we can give that a watch now. So with something like this, where it's a known creature, they just don't want to admit we have them in this area. How does that tie into some of these other creatures like Bigfoot? If we can't get anybody to admit there's a mountain lion here, like what kind of leap are we up against trying to get somebody to admit?
Yeah, that's definitely something that kind of keeps coming up. Yeah, because like I said, mountain lions, like you said, mountain lions are an established species. They used to live in this part of the country. Their accepted range now is essentially some of the Midwestern states and basically the Rocky Mountains westward, up into Canada and California, all these areas. These are areas where people regularly interact with mountain lions to the extent where, they're basically living with it and they have to adapt to that sort of situation. But if you can't admit that there's even a mountain lion, how would you admit that there's some sort of primate-like creature that perhaps is more closely related to us than a gorilla? I mean, that's really sort of the golden question. And it just goes to show that there definitely is sort of a struggle with a lot of these sort of subjects. And some of them, some cryptids are more outlandish than others. But something like a mountain lion, or like I said, in places like Australia, the thylacine, or the coelacanth, which is kind of the poster creature of cryptozoology, was this prehistoric fish that was said to have gone extinct 60 million years ago until they pulled one up out of the ocean off the coast of South Africa in the 1930s. And you have other species that have been discovered that were thought extinct and turned out they weren't. So I think we have a case of this. It's just there's a lot of different factors at play, and there's evidence that appears to have been systematically denied too. And in the documentary, I'll talk a lot about that. But I was reached out to by a biologist in New Hampshire who claimed to have found scat in 2001 of a mountain lion that was DNA confirmed by a lab out west, and the state of New Hampshire essentially denied it and had the lab actually issue a retraction saying, this was we couldn't verify the sample again.
See, that really rings bells on me because one of the problems with Bigfoot is even when you find hair, you can't say it's Bigfoot hair. All you can say is it doesn't belong to anything we know of.
Yep.
But a mountain lion, if they have a hair sample, it's a hair sample of a mountain lion. And finding scat, that is explicit. That's what it is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, usually with a lot of the Bigfoot stuff, there's been DNA studies done. A lot of times, human contamination ruins a sample and it'll turn up as human or horse or bear or something else. But there have been other times where people have found these hairs and said, oh, it just comes out as unknown.
Right.
Or sometimes even unknown primate. It just looks something primate-like, but you can't identify it. And with the mountain lions, it's pretty easy to recognize kind of what it is. And even, like I said, with the Connecticut cat, it was just determined that its genetic makeup was from South Dakota. They traced that through with populations they had already had on file. So, I had also recently an interview with a woman in Massachusetts, in central Massachusetts, near the Quabbin, which is this huge reservoir, which is all the water supply for Boston, where she had had her horse attacked by something and found DNA evidence, hair and blood, that was confirmed by 2 separate labs that it was a male mountain lion. And the state of Massachusetts initially didn't want to recognize it and then said, we need to find an independent lab to verify this, so they did. The lab came to the same conclusions, and that was kind of the end of the road, and nothing has really happened with that case. And there's a sort of frustration on the part of the lady who had this happen, that she felt that it was almost like it was being pushed to the side.
It seems to me that it is a dangerous animal, a known dangerous animal, and we do have mountain lion attacks happening in California, and you would think that they would at least recognize that they're there just for the risk, because if a human does get attacked, are they going to try to deny it then? I don't understand what the...
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. Like, I get not wanting to start public hysteria, but I know you spend a lot of time out in the woods. Wouldn't you, public safety, this whole region is very big on, outdoor enthusiast activities. You'd think a public safety at some point they would have to say, well, there might be at least.
Right. I think if you talk to individual people who are involved, I've talked to a game warden in Vermont who admits, there probably are mountain lions at some point in Vermont. We just can't say that there's an outright population. And I think an example of, why there may be a danger in recognizing an animal that maybe is just getting started in a region is the fact that, we still have a lot of hunters and people who just are sort of trigger happy. Wolves, gray wolves are another example of a creature that was in New England and no longer is. There have been sightings, and there even was one that was killed in central Massachusetts, I think in the Amherst area, a couple of years ago, but it was killed. So this animal, the moment they kind of get into the region, they're immediately hunted down and killed. And gray wolves, we know the populations are above the St. Lawrence in Quebec, and that they are able to probably make their way over here at some point. But there may be the risk of people just wanting to, if a mountain lion, if tomorrow they were to be recognized in the state of New Hampshire, there would probably be someone out there trying to kill one at some point, legal or illegal. Somebody would be out there trying to bag one, and that's, I think, a risk with a lot of these sorts of things. But you're right. You'd think you'd want people to just say, hey, look, they're here. Out west, they live with them. They deal with that threat. They deal with, just like we deal with bears. You're out in the woods. I'm a big hiker. We're out there. You're always aware that there could be a bear or something in the area, especially if you're camping out. Hang your food up and put in a bear box or do whatever, just to negate the possibility of that. But mountain lion's a totally different animal. This is an ambush, top of the food chain predator. So it's very different. Attacks are not very frequent, as much as you'd think they would be prevalent. They're not as common, but they do happen. So that people, I think, would get very, very concerned if they knew they were just all around in the areas. So
yeah, there's too many things smaller than us that make good meals, and bears don't traditionally hunt people. We're victims of territory disputes, more or less.
Yeah, we're the top predator. We scare everything else away, and chances are most times when you run into a bear, even in the woods, it's going to be more scared of you. And usually that's when people see bears, when they're fleeing. Unless we're talking a huge bear that, is aggressive enough or is used to people, and that's why, unfortunately, a lot of the times they have to terminate the animals is when they start digging in the dumpsters and they get too cozy and comfortable with humans that there's a real threat there, and unfortunately, that's why a lot of bears end up getting killed yearly across the country just because of that reason.
So is the Lions of the East documentary, it's not out yet, correct?
No, it's not out yet. It's still a work in progress.
Okay.
I'm trying hard to get it. I actually I just got the poster artwork in just recently from a buddy of mine, and it looks amazing. I'm hoping to post that within the next couple weeks, and new trailer will be out hopefully soon as well. And I'm thinking either end of the summer or fall release onto probably online streaming platforms and DVD.
Okay, so we'll keep an eye on your website and social media for updates on that.
Definitely.
Awesome. Do you have any other projects in mind or any plans for new projects coming up?
Yeah, I'm always thinking of new things. I kind of do this thing where I start a project and then I kind of get a little bored of it, and I have already 10 ideas for 10 new projects, so I get kind of backtracked. But I'm thinking about, just expanding some of my writing. I really like writing, so I've been doing a lot with my website, just doing blog posts about various sort of cryptozoology things or stuff about champs, stuff that I couldn't really include in like a series. Probably going to do a write-up about this whole Pennsylvania thing soon and really put it into detail, as opposed to, when you just post a thing on social media, you can't get into every little detail. Thinking about maybe a book down the line, maybe something about Bigfoot in New Hampshire. It's a question mark at this point, but once I need to get through this project first before I start going through it. But I always have a bunch of other little projects. I'll continue doing little shorter documentaries and interviews as well. So just like you said, just kind of social media and my website's the best place to keep track of that.
So you mentioned that there's stranger stuff out there beyond lake creatures, beyond Bigfoot, certainly beyond mountain lion. What do you feel would be the most realistic weird thing within the cryptozoology circle that you can think of off the top of your head?
That's a good question. Something I'd probably say either something like the chupacabra or the Mothman. I'd say the chupacabra, it's sort of diverged. Originally, the stories were in Puerto Rico of a little alien-like creature, but it kind of got co-opted into the Southwest and into Mexico and Texas especially, of these mangy dogs and coyotes that were being described as coyotes. So those were basically proven to be real. They were creatures killed, and they're called chupacabras even though they're just mangy animals. And whatever the Mothman was, it was sort of much more connected with UFOs and Men in Black and the saga of Point Pleasant and the bridge collapse that ultimately happened. And we have this Chicago Mothman thing that's been unfolding the past couple of years too. So I don't know. That seems more, people say that's sort of a cryptid. It typically gets lumped in, with Bigfoot and these sorts of things, but it's definitely more on the other side of the spectrum for paranormal, as opposed to something like a Bigfoot, which some people say there's a paranormal side to it. I've talked to plenty of credible people who say that there's things that you just can't explain conventionally, or just maybe it's beyond our understanding at the moment. But something like a mountain lion, safe to say it's much more in the biological realm than perhaps something on the other side of the sort of spectrum.
All right.
Yeah,
We're out of time.
just about.
Just about. All right. Do you want to give your website one more time?
Sure, yeah, that's Petakov Media, Petakov media.com, and there's just links to everything on there. You can listen to interviews and all sorts of stuff on there. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's been great. I'd like to thank the audience on behalf of Mike, Andy, and myself. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we hope you maybe learned a thing or two, discovered a facet of the unknown that maybe you want to explore in the future. We want to thank the folks at Exeter TV. And if you'd like to know more about future episodes, follow us on Facebook at Exeter Terrestrial, or come visit us at the KRI Center for Consciousness Studies at 81 Portsmouth Avenue in Stratham. And before we go, we'd also like to say happy birthday to our producer, Bob. Have a great weekend.